Buenas.
Hello, I'm going to start with my presentation, and this is a talk about love story.
Con mi presentación, y esto es una charla de una historia de amor. Mi historia de amor con la
My love story with the ideas of freedom.
y tiene
And it has 3 chapters because as you study and go deeper into this,
estudiando y va profundizando en esto, el romance va
romance emerges in different ways.
Lo primero que me enamoró
The first thing that made me fall in love with capitalism and freedom
fue
was basically that it is a machine to get people out of poverty,
que es la máquina de la prosperidad.
that it is the machine of prosperity, that it is the machine of well-being.
Uno avanza en
But
esta
of course, when one advances in this idea, one finds detractors. Detractors here accuse the system of being unfair.
Entonces, el segundo
Then the second moment of the romance begins when one begins to study,
a poner a estudiar sobre básicamente
basically, if the system is fair or not.
y uno lo que
And one discovers that it is not only fair, but it is also the only system that is fair.
y como si fuera poco,
And as if that was not enough, the third stage is an aesthetic stage,
donde
where
claramente
clearly one reaches to perceive the superiority of aesthetics of capitalism.
estética del capitalismo. Entonces,
So the first thing to understand is that the history of humanity is a history
donde básicamente
where basically man was always in poverty.
el hombre fue la pobreza. Es decir,
That is, just over 200 years ago, 95% of the population of planet Earth
estaba
was below the extreme poverty line.
es decir, vivían con menos
That
de
is,
un
they lived with less than $1 a day.
Luego
Then
llegó el
came capitalism.
sí, y ahora, digamos,
And now, in a world that is 7 times more people,
más de personas, porque hemos
because we have exceeded the 7,250 million inhabitants.
personas
Yes, today the people below the extreme line are less than 5%.
la
The opposite of this is a phenomenal increase in productivity.
Si uno toma la historia
If one takes history from the year 0 to the year 2000,
el PBI per
the
cápita,
GDP per capita multiplied by 12.9 times.
sin embargo,
However, in the years that go between 0 and 1800, it only rose by 40%,
40%, todo
all concentrated just after the discovery of America.
hasta que
Until what?
capitalismo
Until capitalism arrived, yes, that generated the Industrial Revolution.
PBI se
And from there, yes, the GDP multiplied by more than 9 times.
que se percibe
That is, the other thing to perceive is a strong acceleration of growth in the world.
mundo. Fíjense,
Notice that between 0 and 1800, the world was growing at a rate of 0.2% in terms of per capita.
durante el siglo XIX,
During the 19th century, it accelerated almost 33 times by jumping to 0.65.
en los primeros 50
In the
años
first
del siglo
50 years of the 20th century, it grew to 1.6.
en la segunda parte al
In the
2,1.
second part to 2.1, and today the world grows by 3%.
¿Qué significa esto?
What does this mean?
Explosión de crecimiento,
An explosion of growth, a phenomenal acceleration of growth.
Si ustedes consideran
In
que
fact,
las
if you
cuentas
consider that national accounts underestimate practically 1.15 the growth,
crecimiento, hoy el mundo estaría
today the world would be growing by about 4.15% per capita.
Eso significa que a lo largo de
That
100
means
años,
that in over 100 years we will be multiplying the GDP per capita by 60 times.
que en un siglo
That is, in a century we will be achieving 4.6 times more than we have achieved in the history of humanity.
la humanidad. Y eso se manifiesta en que,
And that is manifested in what?
digamos,
In the rate at which the GDP per capita is doubled. Originally, it took 3,466 years. Then, in the 19th century, that number dropped to almost 107. Then to 65 minutes 74 in the first part of the 20th century. In the second, 33 minutes 35, and now 23.45. So where's the logic of this? What is all this magic called?
La libertad.
Freedom. It is the model of freedom. That is, those countries that are freer, they grow more than twice of those that are repressed. And what is the consequence? That those that are freer have a GDP per capita almost 8 times bigger than the GDP per capita of the repressed countries. Not only that, but also the lowest decibel of distribution. That is, those that are the worse off. They earn 11 times more than those in repressed countries. In fact, if you look at the lowest decibel, that is, the poorest in the free countries, they have twice as much income as the average citizen of the repressed country. But since the distribution of income has a format of a chi-squared, a log normal, That means that approximately 75% of the population lies with less than the average income. Therefore, here it would be very clear that it is much better to be a lion's tail than the masses' head. That is, it is better to be the last ear of the jar in a free country than to be a hierarch in a repressed country. In addition, not only that, but also in the countries that are free, the poverty rate is 25 times lower. And not only that, but also people live longer. So where does all this virtuous logic come from? There are 5 institutions, the 5 institutions of capitalism, and these are combined, for example, property rights with the free markets. That is, you cannot make voluntary transactions if you are not the owner of the goods that you are trading. As a consequence, it is very important that there is no intervention from the state, because when, suppose yes, you could be the owners nominally of something, but the state tells you how to use it, have to dispose of it at what prices. That would no longer be free. Therefore, the prices would not be fulfilling the function that they would have to fulfill, because they would not make sense. So, property rights are very important, so that you are the ones who exchange what is at stake, and that you do it freely. Why? Because that will register a price, and that will be a signal that will be transmitted to the system, and the rest of the agents of the economy will coordinate with respect to that price. And there comes a third institution of capitalism, which is competition. That is, that there is free entry and exit. For what? So that resources can be reassigned between the sectors where the price points out that there is scarcity and that there are problems to solve. And as if all this were not enough, 2 more institutions appear. One is the one that has to do with the division of labor, far from that straw man fallacy used against capitalism, who wants us all equal now. That is, in God we are all different. We are all unequal, and that allows each one of us to specialize in what we are relatively better, something that is known as the law of comparative advantage of Ricardo, that allows each one of us to specialize and see ourselves obliged to what is the 5th institution of capitalism, which is social cooperation. You cannot be successful in capitalism without serving the next with quality goods at a better price. That is, you could hate the other. However, as its economic progress and material well-being, if it depends substantially on its product being chosen by the other, they have to treat it well even if they hate it. That is, Spasha said, where trade enters, bullets do not enter. That is why the stupidity of the flow theory does not make sense. There is no flow. Challenge whoever wants. Where liberal literature speaks of the flow, we never talk about this, because Steve Jobs was not flowed at all. Bill Gates was not flowed at all. Neither were they a flow of IBM. The one who wins money is not flowed at all. That is, here everything is based on social cooperation, and you can only succeed by satisfying the preferences of the next. But then they come to me with the Scandinavians. Because of the socialism of the Scandinavians. Let's see what is of the Scandinavians. For example, look at these guys. Position in doing business. Look at all the goods that the Scandinavians have in doing business. Look at the position that the Scandinavians have in economic freedom. Look at where the Scandinavians are in terms of unregulated labor market. And look at where the Scandinavians are in respect for property rights. That is, of socialism. I think that only the high taxes remained, which also began to be lowered substantially. For example, after they were bankrupt at the end of the 80s, that is, socialism only has the name, because in reality they are more pro-market than people think. So, once you have this plain empirical evidence, the problem of inequality appears, not because capitalism is unequal. Well, let's see how all this lying patronage is sustained. First, the problem with the socialists that start from a theory of value, which is that stupid value theory, That is the so-called work value theory. It's like you to determine the price of something. You can add the costs. It's like one would like to produce wine in a society. Then he takes the cost of grapes, the cost of the bottle, the cost of a label, the cost of a cork. He puts a margin and with that he sells. Do you think about what I can do with a bottle of wine, of that great wine, in a society of teetotalers? Well, I imagine that the production of Vaseline will be increasing at this very moment. Yes, but in addition, it would be such a stupid world that there would be no breaks, and I think there are breaks. In fact, the theory of exploitation that comes out of that is stupidity, because look at this. If there is something that characterizes technological progress driven by entrepreneurs, it is that it saves work. How are the workers being exploited? By using technology that saves work. That is to reduce exploitation. Now we find that in the theory of exploitation, then in the end the entrepreneurs are social benefactors. It seems to me that I caught them in a contradiction. That's why the economic theory advanced to the subjective theory of value, where the prices are determined by preferences in scarcity, and from there the remuneration of the factors arises. The remuneration of the factors is given by something that is called the value of the marginal product. In the case of the worker, yes, it would be the value of the marginal product of the work. That is the salary, which is composed of two elements. The price, with the preferences and scarcity intervene, with what she cannot do well without serving the neighbor, with quality gains at a better price, because if not, there are breaks in the prices era. And on the other hand, it also has to do with what? With productivity. Then, if he generates something that serves the market, that sells people, that arranges people's lives, and in addition, their products are going to be filled with money, but it is fine that it does so, because they are social benefactors. Then that allows us to see what the distribution of income is about. In the end, the distribution of income has to do with how you manage to serve the neighbor. That is how efficient society was, by arranging the problem. And the more productive they are in it, the better it will go. That is then, but what about the justice of capitalism? Then you know what? That all exchanges are voluntary, something that those who look at the value of work cannot understand, because things go according to the work they have. Then what are they going to exchange? No sin. Then I am going to tell you the case of a society where a little boy appears who plays football and breaks it all. His name is Messi. So, of course, everyone wants to have Messi, because they know that if they have Messi, they are going to win everything. Now, what is the point? The point is that Messi, when everyone starts pursuing him, says, and I want more money, to the point that I would like to have 2 collections of the stadium per month, with which we would have to doubling the price of the tickets. The only ones who want to pay for the other Catalans, with which he contracts it to Barcelona. Then he hits everyone. In other words, he ends up being a champion for scandals. The Madridians laugh at him in Madrid, a whole party. Now, when they look at the distribution of the income, Messi is left at the top. Then the Barcelona manager and the Barcelona players. Then all the Spaniards except the Catalans. And finally, the Catalans. Someone could say that this is unfair, if everyone got what they wanted. But let's go to another society. Suppose that I get on a bus with my friend Christina, who has strong social values, and she sits on my left, and suddenly a man comes in with pockets full of money. That seems extremely violent and unfair to her. Then she takes out a baseball bat, puts it on her head, and says, either you give me your money or I break your head. Then the man kindly accesses to give her the money, unassuming that she does not spend it on wallets, or on shoes, or in hotels and things like that. She evenly distributed among those who were on the bus. The question is, could she say that society is fair? So, what we also have to see is that, over time, the distribution of income is improving. Look at what it was in the 60s. In the 80s, it was much less unequal. In the 2000s, it was much less unequal. The GI index has been falling steeply. And look at what distribution of income was in 2003 in 2011. That is to say that with the passage of time, the world is becoming more equal. So now we are facing the situation of claiming with all the letters that social justice is unfair. Why? First, let's understand populist logic. Populist logic is basically part of what is the way of distribution of income. If under average income, 75% of the population lives, there is a great electoral business that is to talk about poor and rich, and that we are going to get the rich to give to the poor. When that happens, what is the result? Electorally, it is a lot, because you are talking about 75% of the population. But what you have to understand is that the cake is not something that is fixed, but that by the theory of distribution. You already saw that it is a dynamic process that is generated in the market. Because if you produce something that does not serve anyone, then you go bankrupt and do not get any income. Consequently, what you have there is that the logic of populism and socialism, what it does is to destroy incentives. It makes the cake end up being smaller, and that we all end up being poorer. In fact, it was always a system based on generating a lot of misery. So what did Milton Friedman say about these things? He said that the society that prioritizes equality over freedom will not get anything from either. On the other hand, the societies that prioritize freedom over equality will get a lot from both. In fact, as John Stuart Mill said, the societies that care more about equality than about freedom end up being a society of swindlers. So here appear two great achievements of liberalism that have to do with equality before the law. Let's look in the case of what is called the redistribution of income, in the case of progressive taxes. In other words, when you create progressive taxes, that is to say, does that record with greater force, those that save the next best, benefit from better quality or better price. What that implies is to treat people in an unequal way, under the law, punishing the successful, with which they punish the production. And in addition, I warn you that this mechanism is arbitrary. Why? Because it is neither more nor less than doing charity, to the point of a gun. So, when you fall into this, without any doubt, it will go wrong. So, in the end, what you have to understand is that we are facing a discussion of values. On the one hand, socialism based on envy, hatred, resentment, inequality under the law, robbery, and above all, trying to equalize those who are unequal. Consequently, a violent system that was always applied by force and took over more than 100 million human lives. And on the other hand, we have liberalism, capitalism, which is neither more nor less than the respect and restriction of the project of the next life, based on property rights, based on free markets, based on little intervention of the state, based on the division of work, based on social cooperation, where saving is rewarded, where the effort of work is appreciated, and all this serving the next, is of better quality or better value. That is, the successful in capitalism is neither more nor less than a social benefactor. But as if all this were not enough, we are aesthetically superior. Look at New York, look at Cuba. I don't know people going from New York to Cuba. Everyone wants to go to the damn capitalism. Let's say it is more. That is, aesthetically we have always been superior. What were the buildings of the Soviet Union? They were grey, dark, without windows. It did not give them light. On the other hand, what did we have? We have the Guggenheim, we have the Twin Towers, the Chrysler Building, the Empire State, a set of beauties. We also have the McKinney and the Minifalda. That is, look at what the Russian cars. It was ice cold. We have the Ferrari, the Lamborghini, the Maserati. In the background, we are in a situation where not only are we superior in the productive, not only have we taken millions of people out of poverty, not only is it the only system that is fair, but we are also aesthetically superior. Thank you very much, and long live freedom.